You will get the most from any Systems to Win video when you launch it from its video home page.
This series of FMEA training videos can be found on the FMEA training page, where you might have already scrolled down and watched the first training video that introduces several important innovations that make your FMEAs far more useful than the first FMEAs that you might have created years ago. And one of those innovations is to introduce the concept of the 7 teachable, repeatable, coachable steps of the FMEA process. And the purpose of this video is to focus on step 1, scope definition. And we can either click that link in the table of contents, or we can scroll down, because before we even start with scope definition, we're going to first pause here for a moment and learn a few things about your innovative FMEA template. You open your template the same way that you find and open every one of your Systems to Win templates. In Excel, select the Systems to Win tab, click the Systems to Win Templates button, then scroll down to the section where you will find an entire suite of templates that you might find useful during your FMEA process, all grouped together in alphabetical order. Let's select the FMEA template itself, and when we click the button, it opens to a help worksheet that is organized the exact same way that help is always organized for every one of your Systems to Win templates. And then when you go to save your working document, the question arises, what do I call it? What folder do I put it in? You can either invent your own systems, or you can follow the suggested document storage and naming conventions established by Systems to Win that have been field proven by thousands of users to prevent broken hyperlinks between related documents. And then your next step is to click the button in the Systems to Win menu to open a blank sheet. It's a common rookie mistake to start doing your actual work on the sample sheet rather than on a blank sheet. Like most Systems to Win templates, the sample sheet gives you sample data that is extremely useful for initial learning for how to use your new tool. But in the FMEA, notice that the sample sheet is actually divided into 2 sections. The top section is where you can learn how to use the tool with a single language. And if we scroll down, we find a second section with sample data where you can learn how to use this same tool with data that's in multiple languages. So although it's always a mistake to enter real data on a sample sheet, on other templates you can sometimes get away with it. But on the FMEA, you can't. If you do real work on the sample sheet, you're going to need to start over. What you should have done was select the Systems to Win tab, and then click the button to open a blank sheet. And then you see this dialog that asks you what kind of sheet do you want to insert into this workbook. At any time, you can add additional sheets for one or more control plans within the same workbook, process flow diagrams, but you should have only one FMEA sheet within a workbook. So let's start there. So then we get presented with another dialog that asks us, do we want a DFMEA or a PFMEA? Is our data going to be in a single language or multiple languages? And up comes a fresh, clean, blank sheet with no sample data where we can do our real work. Our next step is to right-click the tab name and rename our sheet. This is where you do your real work, not the sample sheet. Back on our training page, this is when you would optionally switch to a different language if you don't want to work in English. And this is also when you might optionally hide some columns. The most common columns to hide are these optional ones for ID, filter, and these user-defined columns at the end. And then some users like to just have a less cluttered workspace by temporarily hiding the columns for future phases that you won't be getting to for a while. After entering your header data at the top of the page, which we'll teach you how to do in just a moment, it's real easy to simply select columns associated with future steps and hide them, thereby making your workspace less cluttered as you focus on the early steps. All right, now that you've learned how to open your FMEA template, let's get started with the 7 steps of the FMEA process. Now, especially if you're an old-timer who's done many FMEAs in the past, you might have developed the bad habit of skipping the first 2 steps of the FMEA process, or at least doing a very sloppy job of them. And that's a real easy and common mistake to make, especially because notice that all of step 1 and most of step 2 are supposed to be completed before you ever touch the FMEA form itself. And on the old FMEA form, that first column didn't even exist for parent. The first column was the step column. And I'm going to say most FMEA practitioners really didn't understand what they were supposed to have done before they started, so they just jumped into step number 3 and started filling out the form. That's why on your Systems to Win template, in this upper left corner outside of the print area, you'll find the links to these 2 sections of instructions for what you're supposed to be doing in the first 2 steps before you ever touch the FMEA form. Remember, the purpose of an FMEA is to anticipate, avoid, and reduce the consequences of mistakes. So don't start your own FMEA process by making the common mistake of skipping the first 2 steps. And the first step is to launch your team. Remember, an FMEA is usually developed by a team, not one person. So you launch your team using the same tools and systems that you use to launch any team for process improvement. This is when you might use this button to insert sheet, where you can insert sheets into your workbook of various types. Some team leadership sheets might be an action list, a to-do list, a bowling chart, a Gantt summary. Most commonly, you will start with a team charter. And when we click the button, it inserts a team charter sheet within our FMEA workbook. And part of launching your team is to ensure that your FMEA author is competent using some basic Excel skills. Most importantly, that he or she watches the training video that teaches how to use the button to add rows and how to use insert copied cells to copy rows, move rows, and delete rows in ways that don't damage your formulas. And when you have an author that is familiar with Excel, your next step is to populate the header fields at the top of your FMEA. And that's not as easy as it sounds, because when you click on a header field to enter your data, be careful. You usually don't want to edit your header data right here on the form itself. You instead enter your header data on the VC sheet. Why? Because any data that you enter here on this VC sheet is shared by almost every other sheet within the workbook. Whatever we typed there shows up on your FMEA sheet. It also shows up on the sample sheet. And remember that button to open a blank sheet? That shared header data from the VC sheet will also show up on every process flow diagram and every control plan sheet in the entire workbook. So don't overwrite those formulas in the headers. Instead, do your data entry on the VC tab so that your header data is shared with every sheet in the workbook. And finally, the last step before you move on to step number 2, structure analysis, is to personalize your FMEA template. Even assuming that your leaders have already personalized the master template for things that are common in your organization, you as the team leader always want to personalize your unique FMEA workbook for at least your team members, which you enter on the team sheet. Any codes that you enter here on the team sheet will show up in the drop-down lists in the Who column on your FMEA sheet. And all other drop-down lists are defined on the DV sheet. For example, if I add a unique failure mode to this list here, whatever I entered will appear in that drop-down list on the FMEA sheet. Editing your drop-down lists is optional because you don't have to use drop-down lists. You can instead type any unique text. But if you find yourself typing the same thing over and over, drop-down lists can be a lot faster and easier. You're going to get a lot more out of these training videos if you don't just watch them, but if you actually do it. If you haven't downloaded your trial, do it now. Open up the template and actually use what you just learned.